The Donovan family. The Donovan family name was uttered with a mix of awe and envy in the marble corridors of Manhattan's elite. Their brownstone, nestled on the Upper East Side, stood as a quiet testament to generations of old money. Towering bay windows, a wrought iron fence bordering immaculately trimmed hedges, and a front door rumored to have opened for presidents and movie stars alike. Yet behind the elegant facade, the true legacy of the Donovans was far more complicated than trust funds or business ventures. At the head of the family were Richard Donovan and his wife, Margaret. Richard, a sharp-witted financier with a reputation for turning dust into gold, had cemented his family's fortune through decades of clever investments and ruthless negotiations. Margaret, equally formidable in her own right, carried the poise of blue-blooded lineage, chairing charities and setting trends among New York's high society. Outwardly, they presented an image of unshakable unity and respectability, their every public appearance a masterclass in grace and privilege. But within the high-ceilinged rooms and art-lined hallways of their home, the family's most precious possession was not their wealth, it was their daughters. The Donovan twins, born just minutes apart, were perhaps the family's greatest pride and greatest complication. Evelyn, the elder by 10 minutes, had always been described as gentle, yet quietly persistent. She possessed a classic beauty and a steady, empathetic presence. Friends and household staff alike remarked on her ability to listen, her kindness, and her tendency to shrink back during family gatherings, never quite demanding attention, but always offering support. From a young age, Evelyn had internalized a deep need to prove herself, not just to her parents, but to the world that measured her against the dazzling brightness of her sister. Amelia, in contrast, radiated a kind of energy that naturally drew focus. Sharp-tongued, impossibly charming, and quick with both wit and judgment, Amelia cultivated a reputation as the star of every room she entered. Their parents, intentionally or unconsciously, had always doted on Amelia. She received the first and best of everything: first choice at the breakfast table, the sharpest dress for Sunday service, the lion's share of praise at school recitals. Evelyn, on the other hand, was encouraged to be understanding and patient, phrases that began to feel like veiled reminders of her designated place as the quieter, less remarkable twin. This quiet favoritism threaded its way through daily life. Margaret's glances of pride reserved for Amelia's achievements, Richard's playful indulgence of her whims, and the subtle but constant recalibration of family schedules around whatever Amelia wanted. Even household staff learned early on that the younger Donovan daughter was not to be disappointed. Evelyn's victories, however genuine, paled in comparison, acknowledged with brief smiles or half-hearted claps, never quite inspiring the parental pride she so deeply craved. Yet despite these disparities, outward harmony was maintained. Dinner parties meant laughter and crystal glasses clinking. Family trips to Martha's Vineyard came with matching dresses and picture-perfect smiles. The family's image was sacred, and if Evelyn sometimes felt like an outsider within her own home, she held her tongue. After all, sacrifices were simply part of being a Donovan. What few outsiders understood was how this dynamic shaped the sisters themselves. Their identities, so intricately tied by blood and circumstance, were being pushed further apart year after year. Evelyn's resolve hardened in the quiet moments she was overlooked, even as Amelia flourished unrestrained beneath the limelight. Beneath the Donovan's polished veneer, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would test the very foundations of love, loyalty, and inheritance long before anyone imagined an unfair childhood. From their earliest memories, the differences in how Evelyn and Amelia were treated became increasingly apparent. For Evelyn, childhood was a series of lessons in patience and resilience, while for Amelia, it was an endless spectrum of adoration and privilege. The disparities grew in small, insidious ways, each unspoken, but each leaving an indelible mark on Evelyn's young heart. Morning routines exemplified these divides. Every day, the sisters sat side by side at the vast breakfast table, sunlight streaming through leaded glass windows. The housekeeper would place a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice before each girl, but somehow, Amelia's always had more pulp, just the way she liked it, while Evelyn's preferences were inevitably overlooked. When it came to choosing their after-school activities, Amelia's schedule set the pace for the family. Ballet recitals, art classes, writing lessons. Evelyn was often ushered into whatever slot was left after Amelia had chosen, her passions and requests politely brushed aside as impractical or unimportant. Holiday mornings, which for most children meant unwrapping gifts in a frenzy of excitement, served as quiet reminders for Evelyn that her place was always second best. While Amelia tore open boxes containing the latest toys and designer clothes, Evelyn's treasures were more subdued, books her mother believed would make her wise, sweaters that never quite fit. She learned, slowly, painfully, to hide her disappointment behind a practiced smile, clutching at gratitude as a small comfort in the wake of always coming second. Outside the home, the inequity continued. At school, teachers would often comment on how lucky Evelyn was to have such a vivacious, accomplished sister, comparing their test scores and personalities in front of classmates. When Amelia soared, winning competitions, headlining performances, entire parent-teacher meetings would revolve around her achievements, while Evelyn's quiet perseverance was dismissed as mere background noise. Friends gravitated toward Amelia's confidence and stories, leaving Evelyn as a thoughtful listener standing at the fringes. One summer at the family's country house, the sisters entered a local art contest. Evelyn spent days painstakingly working on her painting, pouring every ounce of hope and skill into her modest canvas. When the judges awarded Amelia the blue ribbon for her bold, hurried project, Richard Donovan had praised her in front of everyone, his voice loud and proud. Evelyn's submission, though technically superior, received only a distracted pat on the shoulder. The sting of being overlooked settled deeper with each passing year. Margaret, though never intentionally unkind, reinforced the dynamic in gentle but harmful ways. "Don't worry, darling," she would tell Evelyn when things didn't go her way. "Amelia's always had a gift for standing out. It just means you're special in other ways." Over time, these reassurances began to feel like reminders that Evelyn's role was to support, to understand, to stay quiet. The message was clear. Her value was measured by her patience and her ability to tolerate being sidelined, not by her ambitions or dreams. Through it all, Evelyn's resentment brewed beneath the surface. She learned to brush aside her disappointments and project the graciousness everyone expected from her. But the ache never fully disappeared. Watching Amelia flourish so easily while she herself labored, often invisibly, for scraps of recognition, Evelyn grew determined to one day prove she was just as worthy. The seeds of quiet rebellion were planted in those years, watered by every inequity, every careless dismissal, every expectation. She absorbed disappointment with a smile. Unbeknownst to her family, Evelyn began to keep a secret journal, filling its pages with sketches, poems, and scraps of private hope. The diary became her confessional, a place to rage, to dream, to declare her worth when no one else would. Each entry strengthened her resolve and fanned a subtle defiance that would carry her through heartbreak and betrayal. By the time she reached her teenage years, Evelyn knew she was fundamentally different from Amelia, not less capable, but less seen and less celebrated. This knowledge, once a source of pain, was slowly hardening into something sturdier: ambition. Even in the shadow of her sister's glory, Evelyn's determination to change her story was beginning to take root, preparing her for trials neither sister could foresee. Sudden death and the mysterious will. The year that Evelyn and Amelia turned 26, summer arrived on the Upper East Side with a suffocating heat that seemed to press memories into the walls of the Donovan brownstone. The season had grown heavy with anticipation as their parents, Richard and Margaret, prepared for a long-awaited anniversary trip to Europe, a journey they had planned for years, meant to mark the triumphs and sacrifices of decades together. On their final morning at home, there was a sense of ceremony to the day. Richard appeared in the breakfast room in his favorite navy suit, meticulously chosen for the flight. Margaret wore pearls that gleamed against her immaculate blouse. With the twins at the table, the family exchanged final pleasantries, travel tips, promises to check in regularly, reminders to watch out for each other. The tone was upbeat, even cheerful, as if the Donovans were enacting a scene from their own legend of perfection. But it was the last time Evelyn would ever see her parents alive. Just days later, as dawn crept through the city, a phone call split the silence of the Donovan home. Amelia answered first, her voice sleepy and unguarded. Evelyn watched as her sister's features drained of color. There had been an accident, an external affairs limousine spiraling, sleek and black, off a rain-slicked Italian country road. The news stuttered through the line, each word peeling back a layer of disbelief. Their parents were gone. The Donovan twins, long divided by rivalry and circumstance, now faced a kind of loss that erased all previous grievances, if only for those first raw days. The funeral was a spectacle befitting the family's stature. Black limousines lining Fifth Avenue, a church overflowing with diplomats, executives, and old money friends. Cameras flashed outside, but behind closed doors, only silence bore witness to their private grief. Amid condolences and carefully worded sympathy, Evelyn moved, half in a trance, supporting Amelia as much as herself, unable yet to imagine how the center of their world had vanished. Yet even as the ache of grief lingered, another ritual, the reading of the will, loomed. Days after the funeral, the Donovan sisters found themselves ushered into a grand wood-paneled office in Midtown. thick with the scent of old paper and expensive cologne. The family attorney, Charles Whitley, awaited them with the practiced detachment of a man accustomed to delivering news, both joyful and cruel. Charles was a fixture of the Donovan legacy, bald, bespectacled, always impeccably dressed. He had survived countless winters with the family and knew their secrets better than most. But as he shuffled the stack of legal documents before him, even Charles seemed to tread carefully, voice lowered and eyes measured, hinting at the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "Your parents," he began, "left behind significant instructions. The estate is vast, encompassing property, investments, and trusts, assets accumulated over generations." A pause. Evelyn felt her heart thump in the hush as he continued. "The majority of these holdings, per the final will, are to pass to Amelia Donovan with a specified allowance for her elder sister, Evelyn." Evelyn blinked in disbelief, hearing each word as if underwater. Amelia's gaze remained fixed on the mahogany table, fingers curling as the details unfolded: the brownstone, the trusts, the vineyards in Napa and the country retreat upstate, all designated for the younger twin, while Evelyn was left with a modest share, well above comfort by ordinary standards, but paltry given the family's fortune and her lifetime of quiet loyalty. Questions exploded in Evelyn's mind. This was impossible. Her parents had been fair, hadn't they? They had loved her. Her insides twisted as she scoured the faces in the room, searching for some sign in that this was a mistake, a clerical error, a misreading, anything but intent. But Charles pressed on, formal and assured, reading the clauses that rendered the arrangement watertight. When the appointment ended, Amelia lingered, exchanging murmured words and cryptic glances with Charles. Evelyn's sense of betrayal was joined by suspicion. Something felt off. The tone, the timing, the subtle air of collusion that had settled between her sister and the family lawyer. In private, when she asked Amelia for answers, she was met with vague reassurances, a breezy insistence that Dad and Mom just wanted what's best for both of us, though nothing about it felt right. Back in her childhood room that night, Evelyn sat alone amid souvenirs of a life spent on the periphery. Was this her final inheritance? Loss, subordination, and a throb of mistrust too strong to ignore? As the city lit up around her, Evelyn silently resolved not to let this be the last word on her place in the Donovan family. The wounds were still raw, but beneath her grief, a new current began to flow, one of resolve and a sharpened hunger for the truth, deceit, and loss. For several days after the shocking revelation at the law office, Evelyn lingered in a haze of disbelief, haunted by a dull, constant ache that she carried through the seemingly endless corridors of the Donovan brownstone. Her entire life, the rituals, the sacrifices, the quiet loyalty meant to uphold the Donovan name, now felt meaningless, swept aside with a handful of legal documents and a signature. Instinctively, she tried to understand, to rationalize, clinging to the hope that some overlooked detail or misunderstanding would right the scales. But the world outside refused to pause for her shock. In the weeks following the funeral and the reading of the will, the weight of loss, first her parents, now her standing, became impossible to ignore. The brownstone, once a place thrumming with the certainty of home, now echoed with a deep, an unfamiliar emptiness. House staff tiptoed around her with sympathetic glances, but their loyalty had swiftly and quietly transferred to Amelia, who now held the legal and social levers of power. As Amelia moved deftly into her new role as the family's public face, changes came quickly. Decorative updates appeared throughout the house: modernist sculptures, bold artwork, the lingering scent of expensive new candles, all signaling a subtle but definitive shift in authority. Amelia, always the more assertive twin, reveled in the new attention. Her laughter grew louder, her instructions sharper, her gaze carrying the confidence of someone newly invested with power. Evelyn found herself edged further and further to the margins. Bills and legal papers, once delivered in duplicate, now arrived addressed only to Amelia. The family's trusted accountant became less available to her. Certain accounts and documents, previously accessible, now required new codes or Amelia's consent. When Evelyn brought up her concerns, Amelia was quick to offer broad explanations. "It's just consolidation, Ev. Less mess, less confusion." The words were delivered with artificial warmth, but underneath ran an unspoken warning that it would be best not to push further. At first, Evelyn tried to accept the new order. For years, she had been taught to be gracious, to maintain the family's image, to trust that her time would come. But the more she watched her sister, the more she noticed oddities: missing bank statements, hurriedly closed browser tabs on the home office computer, whispered phone calls to Charles, the attorney. It began with the estate's vineyard in California. Evelyn remembered riding through the grape fields as a teenager, listening to her father talk about legacy and land. But one day, idly browsing the news, she saw a listing for a Donovan Valley Vineyards being quietly offered for sale under Amelia's name. Alarmed, she confronted Amelia, who laughed it off. "It's just one property, Ev. Too much to manage. You know Dad would never want us tangled up out west." The answer left Evelyn unconvinced. Driven by a growing sense of unease, Evelyn resolved to investigate. Under the guise of nostalgia, she started reviewing family files late at night. She sifted through dust-covered ledgers, contracts, and handwritten notes, piecing together fragments of information. Patterns began to emerge. Properties transferred, funds moved into hard-to-track accounts, shell companies registered to obscure addresses. Many of these documents bore either Amelia's initials or those of Charles Whitley. One afternoon, she attempted to access a family trust account, an account she had been named a co-beneficiary of just years earlier, only to be told by the bank manager that her access had been revoked by legal amendment. "Your sister manages everything now, Miss Donovan. Her counsel, Mr. Whitley, has submitted the proper documents." The manager's tone was polite but final. Evelyn's suspicions evolved into dread. She began documenting everything. She took photos of mail, downloaded statements, and started a password-protected journal on her laptop, a secret log of her growing concerns, observations, and gradually evidence. Every time she uncovered a discrepancy, she sent herself an encrypted email copy. The more she dug, the more apparent the conspiracy became. The betrayal deepened when whispers began to spread among their friends and associates. Stories surfaced about Evelyn's fragile health, difficulty coping, and irrational fixation on control. Subtle hints, barely disguised, appeared in society columns. A well-placed rumor suggested that Evelyn had battled mental health issues for years and was stepping away from the business by choice. When Evelyn confronted Amelia, Her sister's tone took on an edge. "You need to focus on yourself for a while, Ev. Let me handle things. I'm just keeping the family safe from mistakes." Worst of all was the realization that Charles had grown cold and calculating, refusing to answer Evelyn's calls and responding only through curt emails that referenced obscure legal technicalities and our client's wishes, as though Evelyn, once his charge, had become a residue of the old order. Evelyn's world shrank. Invitations dried up. Lifelong family friends, once warm and constant, now hesitated before returning her calls. Even her parents remaining close confidants, those who had always treated her with kindness, grew distant, reassured by Amelia's carefully crafted narrative. The isolation was total. Dispossessed of material fortune and stripped of social standing, Evelyn was left with her memories, her outrage, and the stark, dawning truth that she was on her own. For weeks, Evelyn drifted in and out of despair. She stopped attending society gatherings, let days blend together, barely eating or sleeping. Nights were spent staring at the city lights, mourning not just her parents' death, but the devastation of every certainty she had clung to. She considered fleeing the city or even abandoning the fight entirely. But some kernel of pride and stubbornness, perhaps planted in those years of quiet endurance, held her back. One night, unable to sleep, Evelyn wandered into her late father's study. The room was mostly untouched since his passing, antique books lining the walls, the faint smell of tobacco and old paper lingering. Slumping into his leather chair, she allowed herself to cry for the first time since the will reading, sobbing quietly in the dark until exhaustion overtook her. It was in that silence that a kind of resolve began to take shape. As she gripped the armrest and steadied her breath, Evelyn knew she could not let the theft and betrayal define the rest of her life. If her sister and the lawyer thought this scheme would succeed because she was gentle, quiet Evelyn, they had underestimated her resolve. She had nothing left to lose, and perhaps for the first time since childhood, nothing to fear. Whatever the cost, she would seek the truth and reclaim not just her inheritance, but her name, collapse, and growing hatred. In the days and weeks that followed her complete dispossession, Evelyn became a ghost drifting through her own life, the sharpness of her pain dulling into an ever-present ache. She felt hollowed out, moving silently from room to room in the vast Donovan brownstone, a space that had once felt like home, now transformed into a gilded cage overseen by her sister's quiet tyranny. The physical symptoms of her heartbreak arrived quietly at first. Restless nights filled with shallow sleep, meals left half-touched on her nightstand, hands trembling as she tried to focus on the most mundane of tasks. The days bled into one another, indistinct. Sometimes she would catch her own reflection in the polished glass of a hallway or a mirror. Shoulders hunched, eyes rimmed in red, her hair unbrushed and falling listlessly past her shoulders, and fail to recognize herself. Each morning, the routine that had given her life structure now served only to remind her of what she'd lost. Her favorite mug, once filled to the brim with perfectly made coffee, sat chipped and cold beside a pile of unopened mail. The staff, who had long since learned to follow Amelia's lead, moved about quietly in her presence, eyes dropping, their forced politeness more hurtful than outright disregard. Conversations that filtered through the house's many rooms rarely included her. She became accustomed to silence, even in her own home. What stung most was the swiftness of her erasure. The friends who had once filled her phone with invitations and chatter now responded with vague apologies, or, worse, ignored her messages altogether. The city's social pages chronicled Amelia's ascent. Photos from charity galas, glossy magazine spreads, featuring the new face of the Donovan family. Nowhere was Evelyn's name mentioned, though she sometimes saw herself reflected in the background of a photograph or the footnote of a story, her existence reduced to a shadow. Amelia, for her part, became colder and more remote with each passing day. She busied herself with redecorating, hosting, modernizing, soundtracked by the murmur of her own laughter and the gentle click of champagne glasses. To outsiders, she was thriving. To Evelyn, she was a stranger who now lived like royalty under the very roof that had once nurtured them both. But if Evelyn appeared docile and defeated, beneath the surface a storm was gathering. Initially, her grief left her numb, but numbness quickly bred a gnawing resentment. Her mind circled endlessly around every moment of injustice, every humiliation, her parents' unwavering favoritism, Amelia's calculated manipulation, and Charles's betrayal. Sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, she would pace restlessly in her room, replaying conversations in legal terms in her head, clenching her fists until her nails bit into her palms. Her journal, once a secret sanctuary for observation and dreams, now became her only confidant. Page after page, she scrawled out her heartache and mounting fury, lists of grievances, inklings of suspicion, sharp-edged questions. Why had her parents trusted Amelia over her? How had Charles orchestrated the legal shutout so seamlessly? What else had been stolen from her beneath her own nose? Each entry was an incantation, refusing to let her pain go unnamed or unchallenged. Humiliation became a familiar companion. Evelyn could not shake the memory of the last stilted encounter with old family friends she met by chance at a gallery opening. She had dressed carefully that night, hoping, perhaps, to slip back into the city's bright current, only to find herself politely ignored, with someone murmuring that Evelyn isn't herself these days. Later that night, she'd cried in a yellow cab, feeling both invisible and exposed. The lowest moments came in waves. Some afternoons, she would drift to the bench in their late parents' study, running her fingertips over the albums, chronicling family vacations, birthdays, holidays, snapshots of a happiness she now recognized as conditional. At times, she suspected she might break under the pressure of so much loss, her grip on the world as tenuous as her claim to the Donovan name. And yet, through the fog, something new and flinty began to emerge, a spark of fierce hatred, not the childish kind, but a slow, careful breed, not just toward Amelia and Charles, but toward her own role as the perennial victim. She realized, with growing urgency, that it was easier to be angry than to be broken. She resented being forced into this brittle position. She despised the narrative being spun about her. Above all, she hated the sense of powerlessness that had strangled her spirit since the will was read. Bitterness ripened into resolve. She remembered a conversation long ago with her father, who once said, "A Donovan never backs down from what she's owed." The phrase, uttered with pride for the family's business acumen, resurfaced now as a provocation. If she was, by blood and by life, truly a Donovan, then she would not concede so readily. She owed herself more than submission, She owed herself a fight. The first step toward reclaiming herself was small and private. Each morning, Evelyn forced herself to get dressed and walk, regardless of how heavy her limbs felt. She pushed herself out the door, rain or shine, and wandered the city's parks and avenues. The pulse of strangers, the drone of taxis, the smell of roasting coffee, all reminded her that outside the Donovan sphere, life went on, governed by chaos, but also new possibilities. On one such outing, she paused in front of a law library downtown, transfixed by the glow of lamps on polished wood and the shelves lined with arcane books. An idea flickered. She stepped inside, the hush enveloping her, and for the first time since her parents' death, felt the faint stirrings of purpose. She could not trust Amelia or Charles to play fair, but maybe, just maybe, she could use knowledge as her weapon. That night, Evelyn drafted a new plan. The world might believe she'd retreated, but secretly she pieced together a list of allies lost to the years, discreet advisors her parents had once confided in, a family friend who'd become a respected financial analyst, acquaintances who'd shown her quiet sympathy after the funeral. She committed to learning the intricacies of trust law, property transfer, and the civil remedies for fraud. No longer content to be a passive casualty, Evelyn made a private vow. Every sleepless night, every hurtful rumor, every legal slight would be used as fuel. She began taking stock, photographing documents, logging discrepancies, and quietly networking with the people Amelia thought she'd alienated for good. The mask of composure would remain, but beneath it she was gathering the pieces of a counterattack. What began as hopelessness turned to raw determination, and at the heart of that transformation was her growing hatred, a fire stoked not just by loss, but by the knowledge that justice, once denied, could only be seized. And so, as autumn crept in, and the leaves outside the brownstone withered and fell, Evelyn Donovan laid the first stones of her quiet rebellion. In the months to come, the world would learn that a Donovan's fury, once awakened, was a force to be reckoned with. The revenge plan. In the quiet of her bedroom, with moonlight draped across the parquet floor and papers scattered over the quilt, Evelyn Donovan began to sketch the contours of her vengeance. It was no longer enough to grieve. She had stared too long at the blank ceilings, endured too many sleepless nights, and relived the bitter loss of her parents, her family's affection, and her birthright on an endless loop. Now, each moment of humiliation and every word of dismissal had crystallized into something sharp, a hunger for justice, and beneath that, retribution. The transformation was not sudden. It began with the small reclamation of routines once lost to despair, getting dressed, eating breakfast at her own pace, and reading the newspapers Amelia considered irrelevant unless they mentioned her. Evelyn noticed stories about financial scandals, court battles among Manhattan's elite, and the rare successes of those who fought against unfair odds. These clippings turned into inspiration, then instruction. Her first step was knowledge. Evelyn spent long hours in libraries, first at home, poring over her late father's collection of legal and business tomes, and then in downtown law libraries, hunched under green-shaded lamps. She read obsessively: New York trust laws, forensic accounting guides, whistleblower memoirs, even true crime stories of corporate fraud. She filled notebooks with research, drafting lists of possible legal loopholes and tracing step by step how Amelia and Charles had twisted the Donovan estate's succession in their favor. But Evelyn knew she needed more than information. She needed allies. Carefully, she reached out to people who might listen and, more importantly, might believe her. There was Mrs. Shue, the former housekeeper dismissed months after the funeral; Edward Lynn, the accounting mentee her father had sponsored; a handful of old friends disgruntled with Amelia's arrogance. She approached each one quietly, never betraying too much at once, always listening as much as she spoke. What she received in return was a patchwork of memories and whispers: suspicious checks, meeting minutes, sudden changes in household staff, and arguments overheard late at night. The picture grew clearer. Discretion was paramount. Evelyn bought a new phone and used encrypted email services. She paid cash for a P.O. box, then for a private investigator, an aging but sharp ex-detective named McIntyre, whose specialty was unearthing family secrets with minimal scandal. Their meetings were brief, furtive, always in public places, with background noise to deter eavesdropping. McIntyre reported back in terse, precise memos that revealed a tangle of shell companies, suspicious wire transfers, fake invoices, and backroom dealings between Charles Whitley and various dubious financiers. More disturbingly, several pieces of property, previously listed as part of Evelyn's expected inheritance, had been rapidly liquidated, the proceeds buried in offshore accounts. Every new fact wound like a wire around Evelyn's resolve. She realized that what she'd suffered was not merely a personal or familial betrayal, but a calculated plot meant to erase her from both the Donovan legacy and Manhattan society at large. As McIntyre dug deeper, Evelyn mapped everything, creating a sprawling diagram of relationships, payments, and cover-ups that covered half of an unused room's wall. It wasn't anger alone fueling her anymore. It was a relentless need to unearth the truth. Still, Evelyn was careful. Her goal wasn't a reckless outburst that would damage what little was left of her reputation. She sought a blow so precise it could not be ignored or spun by Amelia's loyalists. She began recording her interactions with both Amelia and Charles, storing audio files safely off-site. She photographed the changes to household ledgers and documented every delay, omission, or outright lie. Evelyn knew the importance of dates and details. She made backup copies of every piece of evidence and entrusted them to Edward Lynn, whose job at a midtown bank gave him access to legal advisors wary of liability. But information alone was not enough. Evelyn had to force her adversaries into the open. She focused on the one arena where privilege and secrets were most vulnerable: the court of public opinion. Quietly, Evelyn reconnected with a young, tenacious journalist named Carrie Mitchell, who had once covered Donovan charity events as a favor to Margaret. Over coffee in a dimly lit cafe, Evelyn shared selected pieces of her evidence, just enough to pique Carrie's investigative instinct. "When the time comes, I'll give you the story of the year," she promised. "But you can't print anything until I say so." She needed the threat of exposure in reserve, an ace up her sleeve. Meanwhile, Amelia remained blissfully unaware, focusing on her ascent up the city's social ladder. If she noticed Evelyn's careful attention, she dismissed it as the jealous sulking of a sidelined sister. Charles grew more paranoid, requiring signatures where there had previously been trust, and convening private meetings with lawyers whose specialties included crisis management. Evelyn relished these signs of discomfort. They meant the cracks were finally forming. The hardest part of her plan, Evelyn discovered, was masking her true self. To the outside world, she allowed the persona of the grieving, sidelined daughter to persist, a strategy both distasteful and necessary. Only in the safety of her journal or in whispered conversations with her few new allies did the steel beneath her gentleness emerge. The mask would protect her, while she maneuvered her sister and the lawyer into making mistakes. Bit by bit, Evelyn built her network wider. She found 2 witnesses willing to testify about forged documents and another who had been bribed to resign her position as a Donovan trustee. Each was offered the promise of legal protection and, where possible, a share of the justice she meant to serve. By autumn, nearly a year since her parents' accident, the framework of Evelyn's plan was solid. She had a timeline of fraud, a roster of complicit staff and attorneys, forensic bank statements, and the beginnings of a media firestorm that could be unleashed at a moment's notice. In her mind, she rehearsed her final confrontation, the evidence dumped systematically on Amelia and Charles. The public's eyes finally opened, the family's circle forced to reckon with the lies spun since the tragedy. And yet, Evelyn was not without fear. At night, doubt gnawed at her. What if she failed? What if the scandal destroyed all hope of rebuilding either her legacy or her life? But then she would remember every slight, every moment she was forced to smile through her own erasure, and her resolve would steel once more. No part of the plan was impulsive. Each move was measured, each step proposed and reconsidered, until there was no margin for error. This was Evelyn's quiet war, her answer to a lifetime of subservience. She understood now that vengeance alone would not be enough. She needed to reclaim not just her inheritance, but the truth of who she was. As Thanksgiving approached, and the brownstone filled with the scent of roasting chestnuts and the echo of shallow, brittle laughter, Evelyn set her traps. The next phase, in court, in public, in every corner of the Donovan legacy, would be the reckoning her enemies never saw coming. The truth-exposed winter on the Upper East Side arrived with a brittle chill, setting the city's stone facades and iron gates aglow in pale morning sunlight. Behind the heavy curtains of the Donovan brownstone, however, warmth had all but vanished. Even as fireplaces flickered in every room, a feeble attempt at comfort, the sharp edges of distrust and anticipation filled the house with an electricity no velvet chair or antique rug could soften. For months, Evelyn had lived in the twin shadows of grief and conspiracy, but now her carefully assembled arsenal of evidence rested in a locked briefcase beneath her bed, while encrypted dossiers sat ready in off-site cloud storage and a safety deposit box. She'd spent endless nights rehearsing what needed to be said, what had to be shown, and how each revelation might shift the balance of power. The time for secrets, she decided, was over. The first domino to fall was small. A quiet but deliberate leak to Carrie Mitchell, the journalist she'd come to trust. An innocent-sounding tip about questionable property transfers within a high-profile estate. No names mentioned, just enough to set a skilled investigator circling. Within days, Carrie had traced the shell companies used to funnel Donovan assets into clandestine accounts controlled by close family advisors. The pattern was familiar enough to be damning, even before the names Amelia Donovan and Charles Whitley entered the story. From there, Evelyn widened her campaign. She began quietly reconnecting with former staff and family friends, the ones who had quietly vanished from Amelia's social calendar once they'd served their purpose or gotten too close to uncomfortable truths. Over tea in hush-hush hotel lounges and brief meetings in sunlit parks, she pressed assess for recollections, signatures, and statements. Some, like the devoted Mrs. Shue, confessed to having been paid off after witnessing documents signed in her absence. Others provided emails, bank slips, even coded ledgers that seemed meaningless until Evelyn's wall-length diagram connected the dots. Throughout this process, Evelyn grew stronger. There was power in assembling the truth from fragments no one else had noticed or cared to notice. Every new discovery became both shield and blade, emboldening her to confront not only her enemies, but the stifling fear of being unheard that had dogged her since childhood. Around this time, subtle shifts began appearing in society columns and online gossip sites. Formerly glowing profiles of the Donovan sisters developed hairline cracks, hints of internal division, whispered questions about missing family assets, suspicions, always lightly worded, about irregularities in the Donovan Foundation's charitable giving. Carrie Mitchell's reporting, grounded, precise, unassailably sourced, soon attracted the attention of larger outlets. In a matter of weeks, the rumors surrounding the Donovans became a city-wide hum. All the while, Evelyn set the stage for the main event, the legal confrontation that would demand public transparency. She reached out to a veteran trust and estate attorney, Rachel Kim, whose reputation was built on defending the vulnerable from predatory family schemes. Meeting late at night in Rachel's office, Evelyn handed over her meticulously organized folders. She watched as Rachel's professional mask slipped into frowns, then astonishment, then a steely indignation. "This is beyond simple fraud," Rachel murmured. "You realize what you're sitting on? This isn't just about inheritance. It's about the deliberate erasure of your legal and social identity." The initial court filings sparked not only legal but social aftershocks. Whitley and Amelia, blindsided by the petition and the threat of an official audit, scrambled to contain the fallout. They'd underestimated Evelyn, convinced the public image of the mild, broken sister was too strong a shield to ever crack. But as the news snowballed and subpoenas landed, their veneer of unity and respectability began to fracture. The next phase was the formal deposition. Evelyn sat beneath the severe lights of a conference room, hands folded and voice steady as she recounted in painful detail her years of patient exclusion and mounting suspicion. Her testimony was bolstered by forensic accountants, staff whistleblowers, and a paper trail that mapped in excruciating detail the assets funneled away before and after her parents' deaths. Throughout the proceedings, agonizing truths surfaced, some new, some long suspected, and finally confirmed. One particularly damning revelation emerged from the old family physician who had retired quietly 2 years prior. Called to testify, he described pressure from Charles and Amelia to alter his documentation of Margaret Donovan's mental state in her final years, suggesting diminished judgment that would justify rewriting the will. The implication was clear. Margaret's wishes had likely been forged, her lucid periods dismissed to shift the arc of inheritance. Other secrets rose from the depths: lapses in Richard's alleged business acumen, side deals that had left holes in the Donovan fortune, an assorted attempt by Charles to blackmail another potential claimant from a hidden branch of the family. None of it diminished Evelyn's grief, but smaller fragments did explain the emotional distance she'd always felt between herself and her parents. The extent to which old wounds and ulterior motives had shaped both her sister's character and the family's decline. The weight of these revelations was immense. During breaks in the proceedings, Evelyn would leave the conference room and wander the courthouse corridors, steadying herself in silence. Sometimes anxiety pressed so hard on her chest she felt she might collapse. Yet each time she saw the way Whitley sweated under cross-examination, or how Amelia's gaze darted anxiously whenever a new document was produced, Evelyn remembered why she had begun this campaign in the first place. Word of the ongoing case generated its own momentum. Public curiosity, media scrutiny, even hushed conversations among the city's legal elite. When Carrie published a long-form exposé with names, figures, and photographed ledgers, her article went instantly viral, sparking an online outcry about old money corruption and the shadowy inheritance games played behind closed doors. For New York's high society, the facade of Donovan respectability shattered overnight. Invitations vanished. Endowments were frozen pending review. Old friends called one another in disbelief, wondering how they'd missed so much for so long. The chilling power of truth was that, once spoken, it could never be reburied. The most profound transformation, however, was Evelyn's own. Parsing pain into purpose had taken her to the very edge of despair, but summoning the courage to expose years of deceit and her role in surviving it ultimately gave her a new voice. She no longer flinched from attention. If anything, she learned to speak louder, clearer, her testimony a beacon for anyone who doubted the necessity of justice. When the day closed on the last round of depositions, Rachel Kim offered Evelyn a rare, genuine smile. There's still a long road ahead, but you did what so few ever manage. You made them see you. That night, as Evelyn walked home beneath a hooded star-bright sky, she lingered at the gates of the brownstone. For the first time in years, she saw it not as a prison, but as a monument, one she was finally reclaiming with the one weapon neither Amelia nor Charles had ever valued: the truth. Confrontation and judgment. The city awoke under a shroud of gray clouds as the Donovan trial opened in a packed Manhattan courtroom. Outside, reporters jostled for position, cameras flashing as the main players arrived. Amelia in a trim black suit, lips pressed into a tight line. Charles Whitley at her side, noticeably thinner, chin tucked into his collar. Evelyn, supported by her attorney, Rachel Kim, and a handful of quiet supporters, walked in calm and composed, her expression resolute and eyes clear. For the first time since her parents' funeral, she felt at peace with being seen. Inside, the room buzzed with anticipation. High-backed chairs cast long shadows in the harsh winter light, and society's elite filled the benches: former Donovan business partners, old family friends, and society columnists hungry for a headline. It was not only a trial over money, but a public reckoning, an inevitable confrontation, where respectability and family loyalty would clash with ugly truths. The judge, a stern woman, known for her intolerance of theatrics, set the tone at once. This court will address the validity of the Donovan will, the alleged fraud, and the conduct of Mr. Charles Whitley and Ms. Amelia Donovan in the months following the deaths of Richard and Margaret Donovan. Her gavel struck. The proceedings began. Rachel Kim delivered the opening statements for Evelyn, her words measured and forceful. This is the story of a daughter's erasure, not simply from the material record, but from her own family's history. Ms. Donovan seeks not only restoration of her inheritance, but acknowledgement of the truth stolen from her since the day her parents died. Eyes darted between Evelyn and the defense table. The opposing counsel, a formidable legal team hired by Amelia, tried to frame the entire saga as a family misunderstanding, complicated by grief. But there was no sympathy in the courtroom. Evidence flooded in. Documents massaged and amended, signatures mismatched and suspiciously timed. Phone records uncovering calls between Whitley and Amelia in the days surrounding critical legal maneuvers. Each exhibit felt like a brick in a wall that, for years, had kept Evelyn locked out of her own life. When Evelyn took the witness stand, the room went silent. Her voice was steady, though her hands, hidden in her lap, trembled. She answered questions about her upbringing, her relationship with her parents, the strange behavior from Amelia and Charles after the funeral, the emotionally wounding rumors about her mental health. The cross-examination was aggressive, prodding at her character, painting her as unstable and jealous. But for every attempt to undermine her, Evelyn had answers, thoughtful, factual, bolstered by entries from her journal and corroborated by friends and former staff. It was not only Evelyn whose composure was tested. Amelia's testimony, initially cool and dismissive, began to unravel under Rachel's questions. When presented with emails and secret payouts to former household staff, she wavered. "I was under a lot of pressure," she said, the tight control in her voice faltering for the first time. Charles fared even worse. Confronted with his own signatures on illegally altered documents, his confident facade crumbled. He denied direct involvement, then contradicted himself, a sequence the judge noted, unimpressed. Over several days, the illusion of Donovan unity fell away. Rachel called in witness after witness, the loyal Mrs. Shue, who described being dismissed after questioning Whitley, Edward Lynn, who traced a suspicious wire transfer from a trust intended for Evelyn to a private offshore account tied to Amelia, the retired family physician who explained how he'd been pushed to rewrite Margaret Donovan's medical records. Each testimony chipped further at Amelia's and Charles's credibility, revealing a systematic effort not just to defraud Evelyn, but to erase her as an obstacle. The prosecution's forensic accountants unraveled a paper trail of corporate shell companies, hidden trusts, and hasty property sales. At every turn, evidence pointed back to Charles's orchestrations with Amelia's eager approval. The betrayal felt complete, a total stripping of not only assets, but identity. In cross-examination, Charles grew flustered, sometimes evasive, sometimes pleading ignorance. Amelia, too, began to adopt a sullen silence, her arrogance replaced by a defensive, scornful quiet. The courtroom itself became a stage for a larger reckoning. Spectators whispered as details spilled forth, how rumors of mental instability had been deliberately seeded, how friends were manipulated or paid off, how even close family advisors had been sidelined. Evelyn's strength under questioning became a central story, flipping public perception. No longer was she the forgotten sister, but a woman fighting for her dignity and her name. As closing arguments approached, Rachel Kim addressed the court in a voice that resonated with conviction. Evelyn Donovan was made a stranger in her own home, but today she has reclaimed her story. This is about justice, not just property. This is a warning to all who wield power at the expense of truth and decency. The defense, outnumbered on facts and shaken by so much unveiled treachery, fell back on legal technicalities, citing convoluted business logic, family intent, the letter of the law. But the spirit of the law, of fairness and family, stood against them. Finally, it was time for the judge's decision. For days, New York social circles buzzed with speculation. On the appointed morning, the court reconvened. The judge's ruling was clear and resolute. There is compelling evidence of systematic fraud and coercion. The will cannot stand in its current form, and the actions of Ms. Amelia Donovan and Mr. Charles Whitley constitute deliberate harm. As her words echoed in the marble hall, silence sank over the crowd. The assets were to be returned to their rightful divisions, and further charges were ordered to be investigated against Charles and Amelia. Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes. Tears not of pain, but profound relief and vindication. Around her, murmurs of support and sympathy rose. Strangers and distant friends alike acknowledging what she had endured. Outside, the city's relentless noise resumed, but the brownstone gates, once locked so determinedly against her, now seemed to open. For Evelyn, justice had come not as a sudden victory, but as a slow, arduous restoration, a return not only of fortune, but of self-respect and faith in her own voice. The Donovan legacy would forever bear the scars of this trial. Yet, for the first time in her life, Evelyn could walk forward carrying her truth, unbowed. Restoration of honor and justice. The days following the court's historic verdict moved slowly, each one steeped in a kind of quiet that no longer felt suffocating, but solemn, almost sacred. For Evelyn Donovan, the world outside the courtroom seemed transformed. The tense fog hanging over the city's glossiest neighborhoods had lifted. In its place, a crisp sense of possibility lingered in the midwinter air. The first morning after the judgment, Evelyn awoke before dawn. For the first time in months, her rest was deep, dreamless. She allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, listening to the silence stretch between the polished ceilings. Before morning light crept over the brownstone's windowsills, each breath felt lighter, the weight on her chest replaced by a cautious but growing sense of peace. She made a simple breakfast and sipped coffee at the bay window, watching the street below as everyday life resumed. Even the city's familiar din, delivery trucks, dog walkers, the muffled hum of morning traffic, took on a new character. It wasn't the noisy, indifferent chaos that had once made her feel alone. It was alive with newness, as though the city itself acknowledged in its busy way the shift in her fortune. Still, victory was not without its bitter undertow. News of the trial's results had splashed across every society column and legal brief, dissected by analysts on talk shows and whispered about at fundraisers Evelyn was no longer excluded from. Some reveled in the scandal's downfall, treating the Donovan saga as high drama that validated suspicions about old money's rot. Others, socialites who had once turned a cold shoulder, now sent wary notes of congratulation, hedging their bets in the new order. It stung, but Evelyn met these overtures with guarded civility. She answered each letter politely, neither inviting nor outright accepting returned friendship. Her energy was focused not on resuming a faded social role, but on rebuilding the true core of what had been taken. Not just inheritance, but dignity, agency, and the sense of self that years in the family's shadow had nearly extinguished. Her first act was to summon the household staff. Many had been dismissed, replaced, or left quietly during Amelia's months in charge. Evelyn invited them to meet in the Brownstones' main hall, expressing her gratitude for their loyalty, apologizing for the climate of uncertainty, and promising fair treatment and respect going forward. Some wept quietly, confessing how powerless they'd felt. Others offered tentative smiles, hesitantly hopeful that kindness might finally replace fear. Next, she met with Rachel Kim and her small but steadfast group of allies, Edward Lynn, Mrs. Shue, and a handful of trusted advisors. Together, they mapped out a careful plan for auditing the Donovan holdings, restoring titles and accounts, and ensuring regulatory transparency. Evelyn insisted on openness, determined that the web of deception that had fueled Amelia and Charles's schemes would not be repeated. Secrets nearly destroyed this family, she told them. We won't rebuild on lies. Word spread quickly about Evelyn's approach. Old business partners and charity boards, cautious at first, soon called to express admiration for her measured leadership and integrity. She declined television interviews, offering only brief statements to the press, thanking the court for its diligence and acknowledging those who had suffered collateral damage from the family's infighting. She refused to speak ill of her sister in public. Let the truth stand on its own, she told a persistent reporter. I'm not here to gloat. Yet privately, Evelyn struggled with the aftermath's complexity. The victory, though just, had left wounds that justice alone could not fully heal. She felt the ache of her parents' absence more acutely than ever, the realization that every milestone going forward would bear the ghost of what might have been. Their love, however flawed, belonged to another era, and nothing the court restored could quite fill those gaps. She wandered the brownstone in the evenings, pausing before family portraits and old mementos. Sometimes she'd find herself in the empty music room or the paneled study where her father once read her stories and business plans in equal measure. She realized she would have to redefine her relationship with the Donovan name, not as a burden nor as a shield, but as something intrinsically her own. Surprisingly, some of the old friends who had abandoned her reached out, not with flattery, but with apologies. One, a fellow philanthropist named Hester, confessed over tea, "We should have seen it. I'm sorry we let you bear it alone." Evelyn smiled, more relieved than angry. Forgiveness, she discovered, was both easier and harder than she'd imagined. It meant confronting her hurt honestly and choosing whether to carry it forward. As headlines faded and city gossip found new subjects, Evelyn set about the slower, less visible labor of healing. She organized the restoration of the Donovan Foundation, refocusing its mission toward supporting marginalized voices, those overlooked and silenced as she once had been. She sought out community leaders and young activists, opening the Brownstones' doors for meetings that had nothing to do with reputation or appearance. Gradually, she found satisfaction in these acts of quiet reconstruction, seeing a scholarship fund bear her mother's name, or watching the winter sun spill over a reading room her family had fostered alongside a public school. With each effort, she felt the old self, timid, eager to please, fearful of conflict, slowly receding. In her place stood a woman who understood the costs of justice and the value of her own voice. The case against Amelia and Charles continued to unfold in the background. Indictments were issued, further investigations launched, but Evelyn released her grip on vengeance, determined not to let her future be defined by their choices. Her relationship with Amelia, strained beyond repair, remained distant. Yet Evelyn found a strange, unexpected grace in not wishing further harm. Sometimes, walking the city's winter streets late at night, she would feel a surge of gratitude, not for the suffering, but for its transformative wake, for the clarity that now colored every landscape and encounter. She held her head high, not with arrogance, but with the calm confidence of having survived a storm that once seemed insurmountable. And so, as the Donovan legacy entered a new chapter, Evelyn stood at its heart, not as a relic of its excesses or a casualty of its secrets, but as a symbol of its ability to endure, adapt, and finally to honor the truth. Final chapter and the true legacy. With the city blanketed beneath February's fading snow, the Donovan brownstone on East 72nd Street stood radiantly quiet, its stately facade both a monument and a harbor for the woman now rebuilding everything inside. In this season of muted sun and long shadows, Evelyn Donovan found herself more often at peace, a peace she had once thought would be forever out of reach. On one such morning, Evelyn sat at her father's old desk, surrounded by the gentle rustle of new paperwork and the steadfast hum of a house finally at rest. The legal battles were behind her, though their echoes lingered. There were still audits, letters from regulators, and the occasional tremors of gossip from the city's social circles. Yet life's texture felt changed, steadier. She ate breakfast in the same bay window where her mother had once presided, but she now looked out on the city with the gaze of someone born anew. For weeks after the verdict, Evelyn had lived as if testing the dimensions of her restored freedom. She reconnected with staff, invited new voices to the Donovan Foundation's board, and quietly donated to shelters and clinics across the city. She let distant cousins visit, encouraged laughter in rooms that had stifled it for years, and listened to stories of her family's early days. Stories that hadn't crossed her parents' lips in a lifetime. Each moment rebuilt a thread between past pain and present hope. But as winter turned toward spring, Evelyn realized that victory, though hard fought, brought not only its blessings, but its own set of hard questions. What was she to do with this inheritance that had cost so much? How could she ensure the Donovans would be remembered not for scandal and division, but for something finer, something lasting? The answer, she found, was not in the furniture or the trust accounts, nor even in the dazzling chandelier that hung over the foyer. It came in small instances of courage, wisdom, and human connection, a palette of values that wealth could never buy or measure. Bit by bit, Evelyn shifted her focus from maintaining the family stature to nurturing its true legacy: kindness, decency, and the strength to right injustice. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, Evelyn thought of her parents, of Richard's ambition and Margaret's poise, of the ways they had both protected and wounded her and Amelia. Loss still stung sharply, never more so than when she stumbled upon a forgotten letter or caught the scent of her mother's perfume from a closet she was finally organizing. Yet, with the hurt came gratitude. Their stories, as flawed as any, were the soil from which her new ambitions would grow. Though the legal drama had ended, her relationship with Amelia could not be so easily remade. For a time, there was silence, punctuated by the occasional formal letter from Amelia's lawyers regarding the dispersal of remaining shared assets, or choked phone calls that began with mutual apologies and ended in exhausted withdrawals. One rainy Sunday, after months of near estrangement, Amelia arrived unannounced at the brownstone. She stood awkwardly in the entryway, clutching a satchel and her pride, her eyes ringed with a fatigue Evelyn immediately recognized. They walked the house together in halting conversation. The music room, the conservatory, the small library, where as girls they'd spent entire winters escaping into novels. For a moment, Amelia's confident veneer slipped, and she spoke with rare candor. "You always thought you were invisible, but you were the only one who saw things as they really were. I'm sorry, Ev, for all of it. I lost myself in winning, whatever that meant." Evelyn listened, cautious but not cruel. She didn't offer forgiveness in a rush, nor did she give in to old patterns of deference. Instead, she told her sister the truth. What matters now is who we choose to become, not just what we lost or why, but what we do with the rest. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a start, a moment of openness that left the future unwritten and, for the first time, undictated by the past. After Amelia left, Evelyn spent hours reflecting on what it really meant to carry forward a family story. It was never just possession or prestige. It was the willingness to transform regret into wisdom, pain into empathy, and the memory of injustice into the promise of fairer days. The Donovan name, once a silken shroud and a yoke, had become her own, reshaped, claimed, and finally redeemed not through courts or headlines, but through the steadfast labor of living well. Gradually, Evelyn made peace with the idea that no one is wholly the hero or villain of their own legacy. Her parents had loved imperfectly, her sister had broken trust. Yet within those fractures, Evelyn found the seeds of her future resolve: to be kind where others were dismissive, to share power where others hoarded it, and to listen where tradition would dictate silence. As spring pressed forward and the first daffodils appeared along the brownstone's walk, Evelyn hosted a gathering, the first in years in which every guest truly wanted to be present. Artists whose work her mother once championed, scholarship recipients from the foundation, former staff who had become friends and confidants, newcomers to the city who were building their own fragile dreams. At the table, there was laughter, argument, music, and the soft comfort of voices no longer performing, but belonging. Evelyn stood by the window as evening fell, watching the city's lights blink on one by one. She realized at last that This, these honest connections, this quietly earned trust, and this peaceful acceptance of imperfection was the Donovan legacy she would choose to carry forward. There would be more challenges. Old wounds don't heal in an instant. But Evelyn understood now that true inheritance is not a fortune to be guarded, but a light to be shared. A family's real legacy lives not in its shame or splendor, but in the courage of those who refuse to let their story end in bitterness. Outside, the city hummed with promise. Evelyn felt not only restored but transformed. Her story no longer dictated by shadows, but written by her own steadfast hand. In the dawning spring, with the burden of the past at last set down, she moved toward the future, a testament to quiet endurance, hard won honor, and the enduring power of the truth.